Knowing how to make a good two-part silicone mold is a fantastic skill to keep in your prop making quiver. Today I'll show you an example of a two-part mold using this beastly hand cannon replica from Destiny. Hey there fellow maker, welcome down to the shop. Bill here, and today I'm going to be showing you an example of how to make a two-part silicone mold. We've covered a bunch of molding and casting in the past, but today I wanted to give you a specific example so that I could go through my thought process when designing a mold. Let's get started. This is the Ace of Spades from Destiny from my friends over at Level 52 Studios. They wanted to mold and cast a couple copies of this piece for themselves, so they brought it over and we got together to make a mold. The first thing I did was to use a couple of pieces of wood at various thicknesses to suspend the prop off the base and hold it nice and level, parallel with that base board. I also used some pieces of EVA foam to get it just right. These structural pieces were hot glued down to the base. Before claying up the entire piece, I identified some smaller through holes that would be easier to clay up before sticking it all down. Using a variety of sculpting tools, I filled those areas with my clay and sculpted it down to a nice flat parting line. I also added some clay in the barrel. In this case, we decided not to add a third part to the mold and only capture about the first ½ inch of the barrel depth. Then it was time to clay up the entire part. For this, we used a non-sulfuric oil-based clay, but a wet clay would work too. The first order of business was to mash down enough clay to hold the part in place. We tried to bury the pistol about halfway down the middle. This is just some rough work and can be done completely by hand. Once we had all that clay laid down, we started refining the parting line. This is the line where the two halves of the mold will meet. I used my sculpting tools to cut away the clay along that midline, creating a 90-degree angle between the part and the clay. For around the parts, like the barrel, I sculpted the parting line around the edge of the circle. This should keep that circle from deforming too much when the mold halves are pressed together. I slowly and carefully sculpted the parting line around all of the parts, including the trigger well. This sculpting was repeated around the entire part until it looked like it was perfectly buried in the clay. Next, I used a ruler to start figuring out where the mold walls would be placed. These lines were cut through the clay, perpendicular to the base. Using a ruler, I decided how tall the walls would need to be to contain all of our silicone. I have a bunch of scrap 1/8 inch thick foam PVC plastic that I cut to width for my mold box, but of course any sturdy thin material would work, like wood or foam core. To build my mold wall, I cut these plastic strips to length and then I hot glued them to my base around the clay. To help the hot glue set up quickly, I sprayed it with a can of compressed air that was held upside down. As I added the walls, I sculpted the clay to fill in any voids between the walls and the clay or any gaps between parts of the wall. This process was repeated until the entire part was contained. Next, I plotted out where the pouring spouts and vents would go. I connected the trigger to the trigger guard. I also plotted a path for air to escape from the tip of the hammer. To add registration keys to the clay, I used a couple of shop-made tools. These are different diameters of metal. I used aluminum and brass stock because I had it on hand, but you could make yours out of plastic or wood. I made mine by shaping them on my power drill, kind of like a lathe. These tools were pressed into the clay to make an indent that the first batch of silicone will fill in, creating registration. The last step before pouring the silicone was to stiffen my mold walls just a bit. The liquid weight of the silicone can cause the walls to buckle out, so I hot glued a couple of stretchers across the top of the mold box. Now I made an educated guess on how much silicone I would need, but you could do something like pouring uncooked rice into the mold, then pouring that into a measuring cup to figure out how much liquid silicone you would need. If you don't mix enough silicone, that's okay. You can always mix a little bit more and add it to your first pour. For this mold, I was trying out some Mold Max 29 NV. This is a tin cure silicone with a very low viscosity before curing. The NV stands for no vacuum, which means it should have very few bubbles in that final cured silicone without using a degassing chamber. It mixes very easily in a 10:1 ratio by weight. I do have a degassing chamber, so I threw it in there anyway. Once it was ready to go, I poured the silicone on a low spot of the mold, and I tried to just let it flow over the part and capture all of that wonderful detail. And it looks like I guessed just enough silicone to cover the entire part. For a mold like this, I tried to leave a good 1/4 inch of silicone covering the highest part of the mold, which in this case was the cylinder. You can use compressed air to blow some of the silicone out of the way and check the depth. Then we let it cure. This particular silicone cures in about 6 hours, but we left it overnight just to be super safe. On the next day, sure enough, it was fully cured and we carefully removed the mold walls and flipped everything over. Everything looked good so far. Then all of the clay was removed, taking special care to not pull the part from the silicone. While I'm working on that clay, I'd like to jump in and take a moment to thank our patrons. The regular income that we get from Patreon was a huge factor when deciding to move into this new shop space. So thank you guys so much for the ongoing support. If you'd like to jump in and help us out, you can go over to patreon.com/punishedprops and consider tossing us a buck. For your support, you'll get access to regular updates and a bunch of regular behind the scenes videos. Thanks again, let's get back to that mold. A little bit of silicone had leaked through the clay, so I cleaned that up using an X-Acto knife and some tweezers. Any remaining clay was carefully removed with sculpting tools, leaving us with our part perfectly embedded in half of our silicone mold. The mold wall was also flipped over and re-glued around the mold. Before pouring the other side, I made sure to spray on a nice coating of mold release. This creates a barrier that prevents the new pour of silicone from bonding to the previous pour. Then, just like before, I mixed up my silicone and poured it onto my prop, and of course, we let it cure. The next day, the silicone was fully cured and we removed the mold walls. Then we carefully started pulling the two halves of the mold apart. The silicone didn't want to come apart right away, but we were super careful and eventually it did pop apart. We worked our way around the seam, being careful so that we didn't rip any of the silicone. Eventually we were able to free our prop master from the silicone, leaving a perfect negative copy of the piece. Now, the vents and pouring spout could be cut into the mold. I used a sharp knife to cut trenches through the rubber to allow air and resin to flow through those places. The pouring spout was cut in the area that would be the highest point when pouring the resin later. I went and cut out a couple pieces of 1/2-inch plywood to hold the two halves of my mold together. It's vital that these pieces be plenty rigid. This was the last step in creating the mold and we were ready for casting. To start, I dusted the mold surface with a little bit of baby powder. This will help the resin flow into all my tiny details. I also blasted it with air to get rid of any extra clumps of the dust. Now you could cast pieces from a mold like this using a variety of resins, but for this one we used some Smooth Cast 300 tinted black with So Strong tint. Just to make sure we got all of the detail out of this mold perfectly, we decided to cast the blaster in 2 pours. The first one was poured into each half of the mold while they were still lying open. Once that was kicked off enough that it wouldn't run, I flipped one half of the mold over onto the other. The 2 halves of the mold were placed together and the backing boards were used to clamp them together nice and tight. Ideally, we would use mold straps for this, but we didn't have any on hand, so we used just some normal shop clamps. There's a delicate balance here between not clamping enough and having resin leak out of your seam and clamping it too much and deforming the mold. I mixed up another batch of our resin and filled up the remaining negative space in the mold, then we let it fully cure. This resin kicks off pretty quickly, so about 10 minutes later, we were able to pull the mold apart, revealing a perfect copy of our original 3D printed prop masterpiece. All that's left now is for Chris to trim up the vents and pouring spouts, sand on the seam, and paint his brand new Ace of Spades. And that, my friend, is how to make a 2-part silicone mold. As I said before, we do have an entire series devoted to molding and casting. You can find that over on our website at punishedprops.com. Links to that, along with all of the tools and materials I used for this project, can be found down in the description. And of course, if you'd like to see how this project turns out, you want to follow our friends Level 52 Studios. You can check them out over on Instagram. Along with that project, they got a bunch of other really amazing projects coming out. They are wizards at 3D design and 3D printing, and just masters at painting. They are sorcerers when it comes to that stuff. We'll have a link to all their stuff down below. Go on over and check out what they're working on and give them a follow. Thank you so much for checking out this video. If you're new, then please go ahead and hit that subscribe button. We have prop and costume making tutorial videos coming out every single week. And if you have a question about this build, then let me know down in the comments and I will do my best to get back to you. If you're working on any cool molding and casting, then I would love to see it. Please send me a picture over on Twitter. I'm at Chinbeard. Okay, that's all I have for you from the shop today. Thank you again so much for hanging out with me. I'll catch you in the next build.